Usually, when we look at the rise and fall of a historical empire, there's this expectation of a fairly simple linear narrative. Like, you lay a solid foundation, put up the walls, add a roof, and the structure just stands.
Right. You conquer a territory, enforce your rules, and it's clean. It is comforting to look at it that way, you know?
Yeah.
We like our history categorized into neat little boxes of cause and effect.
We really do. But then you step into the story of the Qing dynasty, and that entire blueprint is just flipped on its head. I mean, we're looking at a historical landscape that is an absolute paradox. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Yeah, glad you could join us.
Our mission today is to basically shortcut your way to being profoundly well-informed about the Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty of China. It lasted from roughly 1636 all the way to 1912.
And to get us there, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about an incredibly extensive historical and encyclopedic breakdown of the entire Qing era. So we are looking at everything from their military conquests and economic revolutions to their religious practices, their social hierarchies, and ultimately their systemic collapse.
Yeah, and the grand paradox that I just keep coming back to in all these sources is this. The Qing dynasty was not founded by the majority Han Chinese population. It was founded by complete outsiders.
Right, the Manchus.
The Manchus. We are talking about a tiny minority that somehow conquered a population vastly larger than their own. And they built the largest territorial base in Chinese history. They oversaw a population boom to over 400 million people. And yet,
they suffered one of the most spectacular, drawn-out, and tragic collapses in modern history.
Exactly. It's an epic on a scale that is almost hard to comprehend. Imagine trying to rule the most populous, complex state on Earth as a tiny minority, all while navigating centuries of intense internal pressures and these unprecedented external shocks.
It's wild to even think about.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the beginning with what essentially looks like the ultimate outsider success story. Because if the Qing wasn't founded by the Han Chinese, who exactly were the Manchus, and how on earth did they pull this off?
Right, so the founders of the Qing descended from a sedentary farming and hunting people called the Jurchens.
The Jurchens, okay.
Yeah, they lived in the northeast beyond the Great Wall, in the region that now makes up the Chinese provinces of Jilin and Heilongjiang.
Yeah.
And in the late 16th century, they were highly fractured.
Until a minor chieftain named Nurhaci steps onto the scene and starts uniting these clans.
Exactly.
But what caught my eye in the research is that Nurhaci wasn't some isolated warrior from the deep woods. Like, he actually had a really deep understanding of Chinese culture.
He did. Nurhaci was technically a vassal of the reigning Ming dynasty.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he officially considered himself a guardian of the Ming border. But crucially, he likely spent time in a Han household in his youth, so he became completely fluent in Chinese and Mongolian.
That's a huge advantage.
Massive. He even read classic Chinese novels. You know, books like Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin.
That is such a fascinating detail to me. He's essentially reading the great Chinese military and political epics, absorbing their strategy, understanding their psychology.
Right. While quietly preparing to overthrow them.
Exactly. It is a profound level of cultural synthesis right from the start. But his true stroke of genius wasn't just cultural understanding, right? It was structural.
Yeah. As he united the tribes, he realized that the traditional decentralized tribal structures just wouldn't hold up against the massive Ming armies. So he created the 8 Banners system.
The 8 Banners. I see this mentioned constantly in the sources as the backbone of their success. But I'm trying to wrap my head around how it actually functioned day to day. It wasn't just a military unit, was it?
Not at all. It's best to think of the 8 Banners as a hybrid military, social, and economic organization. Imagine your entire life.
Like everything.
Everything. Your family, your job, your land, your taxes, and your military service. It's all dictated by the specific banner you're born into or assigned to.
Wow.
You live with your banner, you march with your banner. But the absolute genius of Nurhaci's system was that it wasn't exclusive to ethnic Manchus.
Wait, really? So if I'm a Mongolian cavalryman or like a Han Chinese artillery expert and I surrender to Nurhaci, I don't just get executed or enslaved?
Quite the opposite. If you brought skills to the table, you were brought into the fold. You were assigned to a Mongol banner or a Han banner. They gave you land, a salary, and a place in the new social hierarchy.
So the 8 banners is almost like a brilliant corporate merger strategy.
Yeah.
You buy out your competitors, put them in your uniform, and make them stakeholders in your own expansion.
That's a really good analogy, but I'd take it a step further. It was fundamentally about survival. I mean, they recognized they completely lacked the numbers to conquer Ming China alone. If they didn't bring the Han Mongols in, they would have been swallowed whole by the sheer demographics of the region. By integrating these conquered populations, they built this massive multi-ethnic war machine.
And the numbers are staggering.
They are. By 1648, ethnic Manchus were actually a minority within their own banner system.
Wait, a minority?
Yeah, only 16%. Han bannermen dominated at 75%.
Well, 16%. So the Manchu army conquering China was mostly Han Chinese. That totally shifts how we have to view this conquest.
It really does.
But the transition from Nurhaci to his son Hong Taiji is where the whole branding of this enterprise changes. Because in 1635, Hong Taiji officially adopts the name Manchu for his people, and then in 1636, he changes the name of their state from the Great Jin to the Great Qing.
Why do a total rebrand right before you invade?
Well, because the naming strategy was brilliant psychological warfare.
How so?
You have to look at the cosmology of the time. The previous dynasty, the Ming, used a character that means bright and is cosmologically associated with the element of fire. Okay, I think I see where this is going.
Right. Hong Taiji chose the character King, which means clear or pure. And crucially, in the Chinese zodiacal and elemental system, King is associated with the element of water.
And water puts out fire.
Exactly. It was a cosmological statement of inevitable victory. The King will extinguish the Ming.
Wow.
It also carried deep Buddhist implications of perspicacity and enlightenment. They were signaling to the Han Chinese population that they weren't just barbarian raiders from the north, you know.
Right, they were the legitimate cosmologically ordained successors to the mandate of heaven.
Yes, they were speaking to the Chinese in their own philosophical language.
And that cosmological acclaim crashes into harsh reality in 1644 with the dramatic fall of Beijing. But here's the twist. The Manchus didn't actually take the capital first.
No, they didn't. By 1644, the Ming dynasty was collapsing under its own weight. The state was bankrupt, terrible famines were ravaging the countryside, and massive peasant rebellions had erupted all over.
It was chaos.
Total chaos. A rebel coalition led by a former minor postal official named Li Zicheng actually sacked Beijing first.
A postal official?
Yeah. And the last Ming emperor climbed a hill behind the Forbidden City known as Coal Hill and committed suicide by hanging himself from a tree. The Ming dynasty was effectively over.
So Li Zicheng takes the capital. He thinks he's starting a new dynasty. But then we have this incredible historical pivot point at the Great Wall, specifically at the Shanghai Pass, where the wall meets the sea.
Yes. The Ming general Wu Sangui was stationed there with a massive, highly trained army.
Okay.
His entire job was to defend the pass and keep the Manchus out of China proper. But with Beijing fallen to peasant rebels, Wu is trapped.
Put yourself in Wu Sangui's shoes for a second.
Right.
He has to make an impossible choice. He can surrender to Li Zicheng, the peasant rebel who, according to our sources, had taken Wu's own father hostage in Beijing and had allegedly taken Wu's favorite concubine for himself.
Which is quite the motivator.
Right. Or he opens the gates of the Great Wall and lets the Manchus, this foreign army he has spent his entire life fighting, into the country.
And he chose the Manchus.
Wow.
Wu Sangui allied with the Manchu prince Regent Dorgan. Together, they opened the pass, rode down to Beijing, and completely crushed the peasant rebels.
But of course, once the Manchus were through the wall, they weren't going to just pat Wu Sangui on the back, pack up, and go home to the northeast.
No, absolutely not.
Right. They hold a highly publicized formal funeral for the last Ming emperor to show the population, hey, we are here to restore order and avenge your emperor, and then they claim the throne for themselves.
Yep.
But conquering a capital city in the chaos of a civil war is one thing. Actually ruling a vast, deeply hostile nation of millions as a tiny ethnic minority,
Right.
that requires extreme and frankly brutal psychological control. Which brings up something in the sources that I found genuinely shocking.
The Q order.
The 1645 Q order.
Yes.
This is where the story shifts from a straightforward military conquest to absolute visceral societal engineering. So we're in 1645. Prince Regent Dorgan issues an edict stating that all adult Han Chinese men must shave the front of their heads and comb the remaining hair in the back into a long braid.
The traditional Manchu Q.
Right. And the penalty for refusing is execution. The phrase from the time was literally, to keep the hair, you lose the head. To keep your head, you cut the hair.
It's a chilling piece of legislation. What's fascinating here is how a simple hairstyle becomes a lethal mechanism of state control.
Yeah, explain that.
Well, to the Manchus, this was a highly practical loyalty test. If you are a tiny minority occupying a massive country, how do you instantly distinguish a loyal subject from a rebel?
You look at their head.
Exactly. You could spot a rebel from 100 yards away.
Correct.
But to the Han Chinese, this wasn't just a humiliating new fashion trend. It was a profound violation of their deepest beliefs.
Because in traditional Confucianism, your body, your hair, your skin, they're sacred gifts from your parents.
That is the core of filial piety. The classic text states that you must not damage the body your parents gave you. So forcibly shaving the head was seen as a severe mutilation. It was an act of extreme, unfilial behavior.
So they are forcing millions of men to choose between their lives and their immortal souls, essentially.
Yes, and it triggered massive, desperate resistance, particularly in the wealthy, highly cultured south of China, down in the Jiangnan region.
And the pushback was intense.
Very intense.
Yeah.
And the Manchu retaliation was horrific. The sources note that some 100,000 Han Chinese were slaughtered in the ensuing crackdowns in cities like Yangzhou and Jiading. Entire cities were put to the sword because they refused to cut their hair.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Wait, so they forced this incredibly oppressive, violently enforced haircut rule on the population. They slaughtered tens of thousands who resist. But at the exact same time, the sources say the king were actively pushing this propaganda ideology of Zheng Weiji, which means home and abroad as one family.
Right.
How do they balance that cognitive dissonance? I mean, you can't just massacre a city and then hand out pamphlets saying, hey, we're all one big happy family now.
It is a staggering contradiction. But the Qing leadership understood that terror alone has a very short shelf life.
Okay.
You can conquer on horseback, but you can't rule from it. To survive long term, they had to fundamentally redefine the concept of China itself.
How so?
Well, in the Chinese language, the term is Zhonggua, which translates to the Middle Kingdom. Historically, that term was mostly used to describe the lands populated exclusively by the Han Chinese. But the Manchus radically expanded the definition.
Okay.
They began using the term China and King interchangeably in their official documents, in treaties with foreign powers, and crucially, on their maps.
Ah, so they made the identity multi-ethnic.
Yes. They declared that China now encompassed Manchuria, the vast western regions of Xinjiang, the steppes of Mongolia, the highlands of Tibet, and the traditional Han areas.
That's a massive shift.
It was. They were sending a very clear message to the Han population, like, you are no longer the exclusive owners of this identity. We are all part of a massive, multi-ethnic family united under the Qing state.
And they back this up with early social policies, too, like the intermarriage laws. The sources mention that in 1648, to promote this ethnic harmony, the king allowed Han civilian men to marry Manchu banner women, provided they had the right bureaucratic permissions.
That is a perfect example of their pragmatic statecraft.
Yeah.
It was a calculated move to bind the elites of the conquered population to their conquerors through bloodlines.
Right?
If the local Han magistrate's son is married to a Manchu commander's daughter, that magistrate is far less likely to rebel.
Makes total sense. Though it is worth noting that the sources also say the king later abolished these intermarriage policies once the dynasty was truly secure a few decades later. It was entirely a tool of convenience.
Absolutely. Once they didn't need it, they discarded it to preserve Manchu ethnic purity. Ultimately, pure force, like the Q order, and pure propaganda, like the unified maps, they only get you so far. If a regime is going to survive for centuries, it needs unparalleled administrative competence.
Right.
And the king found exactly that in a 130-year period known as the High Qing, which was guided by 3 legendary emperors.
This is where the dynasty truly stabilizes and expands into a global superpower. Let's start with the first of these 3, the Kangxi Emperor. He took the throne in 1661, and his reign is just monumental. I mean, he ruled for 61 years, which is the longest reign in all of Chinese history.
And he didn't just passively occupy the throne. He took personal control of the empire at just 15 years old by outsmarting his powerful domineering regent, a military yen named Oboy.
I read about this. It's an incredible story. Oboy was essentially running the country, ignoring the teenage emperor. So Kangxi gathers a group of young, athletic boys, and they practice traditional Manchu wrestling every day in the courtyard. Yep. Oboy sees this and thinks, the kid is just playing games. He's not interested in politics. Then one day, oh boy comes to court, and Kangxi signals his teenage wrestling buddies, and they literally tackle the most powerful military man in the empire to the ground and imprison him.
It is a brilliant display of misdirection and ruthlessness at a very young age.
Totally.
And from there, Kangxi just doesn't stop. He crushes the revolt of the three feudatories, which, ironically, included Wu Sangui, the general who originally let them through the wall and eventually decided he wanted his own kingdom.
Wow, full circle.
Yeah. Kangxi defeats him, he conquers Taiwan, he even signs the Treaty of Nerchinsk with the Russian Empire in 1689 to secure the northern borders.
But military victories alone don't explain a 61-year reign of prosperity. The sources highlight that Kangxi realized he couldn't just rule as a Manchu warrior.
No, not at all. He had to be a chameleon. This is vital to understanding Qing governance. To the Han Chinese majority, Kangxi presented himself as the ultimate Confucian scholar-ruler. He sponsored the massive Kangxi Dictionary. He issued the Sacred Edict to promote traditional Confucian moral values. He showed them that he respected their culture deeply.
But when dealing with the other regions, he wore a completely different hat.
Precisely. If we look at how he handled the Mongols, for instance, he didn't quote Confucius to them.
Yeah.
To the Mongols, he presented himself as the Bogda Khan, a traditional steppe leader. He participated in their hunts, understood their lineage systems, and engaged in steppe diplomacy.
And the Tibetans?
To the Tibetans, he projected the image of a Buddhist sage ruler, a generous patron of Tibetan Buddhism. And to his Turkic Muslim subjects in the West, he acted as a Chinese Kagan.
That is wild. He's essentially tailoring his absolute monarchy to perfectly fit the cultural and religious expectations of every single demographic in his massive empire.
Exactly. It allowed multiple distinct peoples to feel a sense of direct personal loyalty to him without needing them to all assimilate into one monolithic culture.
Right.
It was brilliant decentralization of identity, centralized in one man.
So that's Kangxi, the visionary founder of this golden age. Then, in 1722, we get his son, the young Zheng emperor. The sources describe him very differently. They call him severe, suspicious, and jealous, but extremely capable and resourceful.
Yongzheng is a fascinating figure because he does the unglamorous, difficult work of state building. If Kangxi built the empire, Yongzheng figured out how to actually pay for it and manage it.
Yeah.
He cracked down brutally on corruption. He took a notoriously broken tax system where wealthy local elites always found loopholes to avoid paying, and he enforced the land tax ruthlessly across the board.
And he regulated the meltage fees. I want to pause on this because it's a really interesting mechanic of how the economy actually functioned back then. They were using silver, right?
Yes. Silver wasn't minted into standard uniform coins for large transactions like taxes. It was traded in rough chunks or ingots measured by weight in a unit called taels.
So imagine you're a local official. A farmer pays his taxes in these chunks of silver. You have to melt them down to send them to the capital. And in the melting process, some silver is lost to impurities.
Right. So to cover that loss, the officials would add a meltage fee on top of the tax. But because this fee was totally unregulated by the central government, corrupt officials just used it as a blank check to extort the peasants and skim massive amounts of money for themselves.
Classic middleman corruption.
Exactly. So Yongzheng stepped in, and rather than just banning it, which never works, he legalized the fee.
Oh, smart.
He regulated it at a fixed, transparent rate, collected it centrally, and then used that massive new revenue stream to significantly increase the official salaries of the bureaucrats.
Wow.
He gave them what was called money to nourish honesty. He basically said, I will pay you enough to live well, but if you steal from the people now, I will execute you. It was a brilliant structural reform.
And Yongzheng also completely revolutionized how intelligence flowed to the top with something called the Palace Memorial System.
This was revolutionary for imperial administration.
Yeah.
Usually a report from a local magistrate had to travel up through layers and layers of bureaucracy before it reached the emperor.
Right, playing a massive game of telephone.
Exactly. That meant a report about a local famine or corrupt governor could be edited, delayed, or simply hidden by superiors trying to cover their tracks.
But Yongzheng bypassed all of that.
He vastly expanded a system where trusted local officials were given locked leather boxes. Only the official and the emperor had the keys. The official could write a detailed confidential report, lock it in the box, and have it ridden by fast horse directly to the Forbidden City, right onto the emperor's desk.
That is incredible. It's like inventing secure end-to-end encrypted email centuries before the internet.
Pretty much.
He bypassed the entire chain of command and got real-time data on his empire.
And it allowed him to create the Grand Council, a small, highly efficient inner cabinet that centralized authority directly under the crown, bypassing the traditional sluggish bureaucracy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we move to the third emperor of this era, Qianlong, who takes over in 1735. And he inherits this absolute powerhouse of an economy and military from his father, Yongzheng.
Yes, Qianlong's reign is the physical and cultural zenith of the empire. He uses the wealth his father accumulated to launch the 10 Great Campaigns, pushing the borders deep into Central Asia, into Xinjiang and Mongolia, and expanding control over Tibet.
Massive expansion.
Huge. The empire reaches a staggering size of 13 million square kilometers. He also sponsors the Siku Quanshu, which is the largest collection of books in Chinese history.
But the Siku Quanshu wasn't just a benevolent library project, was it? The research shows there was a very dark undertone to it.
It was an incredible act of preservation, yes, employing thousands of scholars to copy massive amounts of literature, philosophy, and history. But it was simultaneously the largest censorship operation in history.
Oh, wow.
As the scholars gathered every book in the empire, Qianlong's officials combed through them. Any book that contained anti-Manchu sentiment or spoke too highly of the previous Ming dynasty was completely destroyed. Thousands of titles were burned. It was a massive effort to control the historical narrative.
So if I'm tracking this arc, Kangji is the visionary founder who scales the startup. Yongzheng is the ruthless COO who balances the books, eliminates redundancies, and builds internal communication systems. And Qianlong is the CEO who inherits a booming monopoly, expands it globally, but then as he gets older, he lets middle management steal everything not nailed down.
That is a very apt analogy.
Right.
The historian Jonathan Spence is quoted in our sources describing the end of Qianlong's reign as being like the sun at midday. It is blindingly bright. The shadows are sharp, but the decay has already begun.
Wow, that's poetic.
It is. As Qianlong aged, he became indulgent. He elevated a handsome, charismatic young favorite named Hessian.
And Hessian used the emperor's blind spot to orchestrate corruption on a scale that is almost impossible to fathom.
Hessian built a vast patronage network. He skimmed military budgets, he sold offices, he embezzled public funds. By the time Qianlong died and Hessian was finally arrested by the next emperor, his personal fortune was estimated to be the equivalent of roughly 15 years of the empire's total imperial revenue.
15 years.
Yes, he rotted the system from the inside out.
Now, while the emperors are playing grand strategy and Hessian is looting the treasury, there is a completely different crisis brewing for the everyday peasant. And this is driven by a massive demographic shift. The numbers here are just mind-boggling. We're talking about a population boom from roughly 150 million people in 1700 to 450 million by 1850.
Huge jump.
How does a population triple in an agrarian society without modern medicine or synthetic fertilizers?
It comes down to two main factors. First, the long period of internal peace and stability under the High King meant fewer people were dying in wars. But second, and far more importantly, the introduction of New World crops.
Crops from the Americas.
Exactly. The global trade networks brought maize, peanuts, sweet potatoes, and regular potatoes to China.
Okay.
Think about traditional Chinese agriculture.
Right.
Rice and wheat require specific soils, lots of water, and flat land. But a sweet potato, you can grow that in poorer soil, in marshlands, on rocky hillsides, where rice would never survive.
Oh, I see.
Suddenly, the caloric output of the Chinese landmass skyrocketed. Malnutrition dropped. Infant mortality dropped.
So the introduction of the humble potato from the Americas essentially doubles, then triples the Chinese population. But this creates a terrifying scenario that economists call a Malthusian trap.
Yes. The Qianlong emperor himself saw it happening in real time. He famously complained in an edict, the population continues to grow, but the land does not.
Right. Imagine being on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. You have 450 million people, but the amount of arable farmland is essentially fixed. So what happens? A farmer with 10 acres has 4 sons. Now they each get 2.5 acres. They have sons. Now the plots are microscopic.
Exactly.
The land is overworked. The forests are stripped for firewood, causing massive erosion. And the society becomes incredibly vulnerable to even the slightest disruption. A minor drought, a late frost, or a flood doesn't just mean a tight year, it means millions starve.
And running parallel to this population explosion is a massive economic shift. The sources refer to it as a second commercial revolution. China was shifting from a traditional command economy to a highly pervasive market economy, and it was entirely fueled by imported silver.
Let's break down the mechanics of this because it's vital. Since the late Ming Dynasty, China had been shifting to silver as the standard currency for large transactions and taxes. And this silver was pouring in primarily from Spanish mines in the New World via galleons across the Pacific.
Right.
But how does global silver trade actually change the daily life of a peasant farmer in rural China?
Well, because landlords and government tax collectors started demanding their payments exclusively in silver rather than in traditional crops or silk.
So imagine you were a farmer in 1750. For generations, you grew rice, you ate some, and you gave a portion to the landlord for rent.
Exactly. But now the landlord says, I don't want your rice, I want silver. If you are a farmer, you can't grow silver.
Obviously.
You must take your surplus crops to a market town, sell them for copper cash, find a money changer, convert that copper into silver, and then pay your taxes.
The entire rhythm of rural life is violently disrupted.
Completely. It forcibly integrated millions of previously self-sufficient rural households into a complex national commercial web. It drove urbanization, the rise of powerful merchant guilds, and regional crop specialization. Farmers stopped growing food and started growing cash crops like tobacco or cotton because they needed silver.
But there's a fatal flaw in the government's setup here, right? Because Kangxi, back in the glory days, had made a promise about taxes.
Yes, his famous tax wresting policy. To show his absolute benevolence and confidence, Kangxi froze the head tax rate based on the population numbers of 1711.
Oh, no.
He essentially decreed, we will never raise this tax quota no matter how much the population grows.
So you have a country bursting at the seams with 450 million people, requiring massive infrastructure maintenance like dams for the Yellow River, the Grand Canal, vast granary systems to prevent famine.
Right.
But the central government's revenue is fundamentally capped at 1711 levels.
Precisely. The government is going completely broke while the population balloons. You have a hungry, densely packed population living on the razor's edge of starvation, governed by an administration that is starved of funds, stretched incredibly thin, and rotting with the corruption left over from the Hessian era.
It's a powder keg just waiting for a match.
And that match arrived by sea. Which brings us to the 19th century, the collision of worlds, the influx of opium, and the outbreak of apocalyptic rebellion.
The 19th century is where the Qing worldview, which had worked so perfectly for 200 years, violently collides with the industrialized West.
Exactly. For a long time, the Qing actively restricted Western maritime trade. They used what was called the Canton system, restricting all Western merchants to just one port, Guangzhou, in the south.
Right.
The Westerners couldn't learn Chinese, they couldn't bring their families, and they could only buy tea, silk, and porcelain using silver.
And in 1793, the British, who were getting frustrated, sent Lord Macartney on an embassy to negotiate open trade.
And that embassy is famous for its cultural clash. Macartney refused to perform the full kowtow, the prostration before the emperor.
Which is a big deal.
Huge. But more importantly, the Qianlong emperor entirely dismissed Macartney's request for better trade terms. Qianlong famously sent a letter to King George III stating that the Chinese Empire lacked nothing and had no need for British manufactures.
Wow.
He saw the British not as equals, but as minor tribute bearers from a distant island.
But the British East India Company had a massive problem. They were bleeding silver to buy Chinese tea, which the British public was entirely addicted to.
Right.
They desperately needed a product the Chinese would buy in massive quantities to balance the trade deficit, and they found it in opium, grown in their newly conquered territories in Bengal, India.
The organized influx of opium was devastating to China. It wasn't just a public health crisis, though widespread addiction ruined millions of lives. It was an economic catastrophe.
Because it reversed the flow of silver.
Exactly. Silver began pouring out of China to pay for the opium.
And remember, the peasants need silver to pay their taxes. If silver is leaving the country, silver becomes more rare, which means it becomes more expensive relative to the copper coins the peasants earn.
Exactly.
So effectively, the peasants' taxes are doubling or tripling just because the British are selling opium in Canton.
It crushed the rural economy. So the Daguang emperor finally decides he has to act. In 1839, he appoints a brilliant, incorruptible official named Lin Zexu to go down to Canton and stop the trade.
And he didn't mess around.
No. Lin confiscates over 20,000 chests of British opium. He digs massive trenches on the beach, fills them with water, salt, and lime, and literally dissolves the opium, flushing it into the sea.
And the British government responds to this destruction of private property with overwhelming military force. The First Opium War begins, and this is where the technological gap between the two empires becomes painfully, violently obvious.
We connect this to the bigger picture. The Opium War wasn't just a military defeat for the king, it was an ontological shock.
Yeah.
The Qing Navy was entirely composed of traditional wooden sailing junks. They were brave, but they were facing the modern tactics, heavy artillery, and steam-powered ironclad ships of the British Royal Navy.
It's not even a fair fight.
Not at all. The Nemesis, a British iron paddle steamer, essentially destroyed entire Qing fleets single-handedly. The Qing forces were completely outclassed and outgunned.
And that leads to the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, the first of what the Chinese rightfully call the unequal treaties.
The terms were brutal. China had to pay massive silver reparations to cover the cost of the war and the destroyed opium. They had to abolish the Canton system and open 5 treaty ports to unrestricted foreign trade.
And they had to cede Hong Kong Island to the British in perpetuity.
Right. It completely shattered the myth of Qing invincibility. For centuries, the Qing had operated the tributary system, where they were the center of the civilized world dealing with subordinate neighbors.
But now
they were forcibly shoved into the European diplomatic system of sovereign, aggressively industrialized nation-states. They were no longer the center of the world, they were a target.
And as if getting battered by the British wasn't enough, the internal powder keg we talked about, the starving peasants, the broken economy, the corrupt administration, finally detonates. And it detonates in the form of the Taiping Rebellion.
Oh, yeah.
I have to say, reading the sources on the Taiping Rebellion, it genuinely sounds like dark historical fiction. The sheer scale and the bizarre origins of it are hard to process.
It is arguably the deadliest civil conflict in human history. Between 1850 and 1864, an estimated 20 to 30 million people died.
20 to 30 million.
To put that in perspective, that is deadlier than World War I.
And it all starts with one guy repeatedly failing a test, Hong Xiuquan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hong Xiuquan was a young man from a Hakka village in the south. His entire village had pooled their money to educate him so he could pass the grueling imperial civil service examinations, which was the only real path to upward mobility and power in the empire.
But it's insanely competitive.
Incredibly strict quotas. He failed multiple times. After a final devastating failure in Canton, he suffered a severe nervous breakdown. He was delirious for days.
And during this fever dream, he has visions of ascending to heaven, meeting a golden-bearded man and an elder brother who tell him to slay demons. When he recovers, he remembers a translated Protestant missionary pamphlet he had been handed years earlier on the streets of Canton.
He reads the pamphlet, connects it to his visions, and comes to a stunning conclusion.
Which is?
He believes the golden-bearded man was God the Father. The elder brother was Jesus Christ. Which means Hong Xiuquan believes he is literally the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to cleanse China of demons.
And he identifies those demons specifically as the Manchu rulers and traditional Confucian idols.
Exactly.
So my main question here is, Hong Xiuquan fails his civil service exam, reads a pamphlet, and starts a cult that triggers a 14-year civil war deadlier than World War I. It sounds wild. Why did millions of people actually follow him into this apocalyptic war?
You have to look back at the Malthusian trap we discussed earlier. Put yourself in the shoes of a peasant in southern China in the 1850s. You're starving. The land is tapped out. The local king officials are corrupt and helpless against the rampant banditry and piracy. Your life is a nightmare of poverty.
You have absolutely nothing left to lose.
Exactly. And then Hong Xiuquan comes along. He establishes the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and the society he promised was a bizarre, deeply syncretic collision of Chinese millenarian rebellion, Christian messianism, and proto-communist utopianism.
Wow, that's a mix.
Yeah. He promised that all land would be shared equally. All wealth goes into a communal treasury. He banned slavery, concubinage, arranged marriage, foot binding, and opium smoking.
That sounds somewhat progressive for the time.
In some ways, yes. He offered a highly disciplined military organization and a divine mission to overthrow a corrupt foreign elite. It was a deeply compelling revolutionary message for the desperate masses.
But the reality of living in his heavenly kingdom was far from a utopia, wasn't it?
Oh, it was incredibly harsh. Men and women, even husbands and wives, were strictly segregated into different camps and armies. And as Hong's power grew, he retreated into his palace in Nanjing and executed massive, paranoid purges within his own leadership ranks, killing tens of thousands of his own followers.
But what about the Qing military? I mean, the famous 8 banners that conquered China in the first place. Why couldn't they just crush this rebellion early on?
Because the banners had decayed over 2 centuries of static garrison duty. They'd become a hereditary caste of pensioners who rode horses in the park and smoked opium. They were completely ineffective against the fanatical Taiping armies. To save the dynasty from total annihilation, the Qing court in Beijing had to swallow their pride and make a desperate, paradigm-shifting compromise.
They authorized Han Chinese governors to raise their own private armies.
Yes, most notably a brilliant Confucian scholar official named Zheng Guofan.
Right.
The court allowed him to raise the Zhang army, funded by local transit taxes rather than the central treasury. He recruited peasants from his home province, fiercely loyal to their local commanders, and paid them well.
So they essentially outsourced the survival of the empire to regional warlords.
That is exactly what happened. Zheng Guofan's Zhang army fought a brutal, grinding war of attrition and ultimately crushed the Taipings, retaking Nanjing in 1864 in a bloodbath.
But the damage was done.
The dynasty survived, but the precedent was irrevocably set. The Manchu military supremacy was gone forever. The central government now fundamentally relied on powerful Han Chinese regional strongmen to maintain order.
Which perfectly sets up the final agonizing chapter of this story, the Long Sunset. Surviving the Taiping Rebellion left the Qing dynasty on life support. They were traumatized by the internal rebellions and humiliated by the Western powers. They realized they had to adapt or die.
This realization sparks what is known as the self-strengthening movement in the 1860s and 70s.
What was that about?
The guiding philosophy was Chinese learning for the foundation, Western learning for practical application.
Meaning what exactly?
The idea was to buy or build Western military and industrial technology, rifles, shipyards, steamships, telegraph lines, while strictly maintaining traditional Confucian values, social structures, and imperial institutions. They built massive modern arsenals, like the Jiangyan arsenal, and purchased a modern naval fleet, the Beiyang fleet.
Wait, I'm trying to think through the logic of this. Can you just buy the hardware of industrialization without adopting the software? Can you build a modern, scientifically driven shipyard, but run it with a corrupt, bloated bureaucracy whose leaders are selected based solely on their ability to write classical, eight-legged poetry?
This raises an important question, and it's the central tragedy of late Qing reform. The answer was a resounding no.
I figured.
You cannot graft a steam engine onto a wooden cart and expect a train. Industrialization requires scientific inquiry, transparent finance, and administrative flexibility, all of which the traditional Confucian system actively suppressed.
And the ultimate humiliating proof of that failure comes in 1894 with the First Sino-Japanese War.
The contrast is stark. While China tried to just buy the hardware, Japan had chosen a radically different path with the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
Right, Japan went all in.
They modernized entirely. They completely restructured their military, their political system, their education, everything. They adopted the software and the hardware.
So when these two empires clash over political influence in Korea in 1894,
it is a massacre. The modernized Japanese army and navy absolutely obliterated the Qing forces, including destroying that expensive new Beiyang fleet.
Oh, man.
The psychological blow of losing to Japan was devastating to the Chinese psyche. For millennia, China had viewed Japan as a culturally inferior younger sibling, a peripheral tributary state.
Right.
Now, the younger sibling had thoroughly defeated the Middle Kingdom. China was forced to cede Taiwan to Japan and recognize Japanese dominance in Korea.
This intense panic leads the young Guangxu emperor to attempt a desperate, rapid modernization program in 1898 known as the 100 Days Reform. He tries to rapidly restructure the entire bureaucracy, update the school systems, and change the economy. But he immediately runs into a brick wall of conservative backlash.
And that backlash is led by one of the most towering, complex figures of the era, Empress Dowager Cixi.
Cixi is incredible. I mean, she entered the palace decades earlier as a low-ranking concubine, but she managed to give birth to the emperor's only surviving son, and through sheer political brilliance and ruthlessness, she managed to dominate court politics from behind the scenes for nearly half a century.
She was a master political survivor.
Yeah.
When the Guangxu emperor tried to implement his radical reforms, Cixi orchestrated a lightning-fast coup.
Just shut it down.
Totally. She crushed the 100 Days Reform, executed the leading reformers, placed the emperor under permanent house arrest on an island in the Palace Lakes, and took direct day-to-day control of the empire again.
But her legendary survival instincts misfired completely just 2 years later, in 1900, with the Boxer Rebellion.
The Boxer Rebellion was a culmination of all the systemic crises. Severe drought in northern China, aggressive foreign imperialism carving up the coast, and desperate poverty led to the rise of the righteous and harmonious fists, the Boxers. They were a grassroots, violently anti-foreign movement of peasants who practiced martial arts and believed mystical rituals made them bulletproof. They began attacking foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, and eventually besieged the foreign diplomatic legations right in the heart of Beijing.
And Cixi, seeing this massive peasant uprising, decides not to crush it, but to harness it. She officially throws the weight of the Qing army behind the Boxers and effectively declares war on every major global empire simultaneously.
Yeah.
That sounds like complete political suicide. What was she hoping to achieve?
She was cornered. If she attacked the Boxers, they would likely turn their wrath on the Manchu dynasty for siding with the foreigners. She gambled that the sheer numbers of the Boxers could drive the imperialists out of China. It was a catastrophic miscalculation.
Which prompts the Eight-Nation Alliance, troops from Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, America, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, to march an expeditionary force right into Beijing to rescue their diplomats.
Yes.
The visual of this moment in the sources is just staggering. Exactly 107 years after Lord Macartney was haughtily turned away by King Long, foreign troops are marching through the courtyards of the Forbidden City, looting the palaces, and dictating terms inside the emperor's own home.
It's quite the contrast. Cixi was forced to disguise herself as a peasant and flee into the dusty western provinces in a wooden cart.
Wow.
The king were forced to sign the Boxer Protocol, agreeing to pay utterly crushing, astronomical indemnities in silver to the foreign powers, bankrupting whatever was left of the state.
Right.
At this point, even Cixi realizes the conservative, traditional ways are entirely dead. The court has no choice but to initiate the late king reforms.
And here is the fatal move.
Yeah.
The final nail in the coffin. In 1905, as part of their desperate attempt to modernize and create a constitutional monarchy, the Qing government abolishes the imperial civil service examination system.
It is hard to overstate the seismic impact of this single decision. You have to understand what the exams were. For over 2,000 years, this examination system was the absolute glue that held Chinese society together.
Because it was the only path to power. Imagine you are a bright young man in 1890. Your entire life, since you were 5 years old, has been focused on memorizing classical Confucian texts.
Yeah.
You spend years preparing to sit in a tiny, walled-off cell for 3 days and nights, writing a highly structured, rigid, 8-legged essay, because if you pass, you get a government job. You get wealth, you get tax exemptions, you get status for your entire extended family.
Precisely. The exam system bound the minds, the ambitions, and the loyalties of the entire gentry elite directly to the throne. It ensured that the smartest, most driven people in the country were heavily invested in the survival of the state.
And in 1905?
In 1905, the Qing government just deletes that system overnight.
So what happens to all those ambitious young men? You just pull the ladder of success completely away from them.
They look for new paths to power. And the only modern paths left available to them are the newly established military academies or radical revolutionary politics. You suddenly create an entire generation of intensely frustrated, disaffected intellectuals and military officers, people like Sun Yat-sen, who realize the only way forward is to plot the total overthrow of the Manchu state.
So what does this all mean? It's the ultimate cell phone, right? The Qing court created a modern, Western-drilled army, the Beiyang army, to protect themselves. But because they had alienated everyone, the gentry by killing the exams, the peasants through taxes, the reformers through the coup, that very army, led by the powerful General Yuan Shikai, just turns around in 1911 when the Wuchang Uprising kicks off.
Yes. Provinces rapidly declare independence in the Xinhai Revolution. The Qing court, in a panic, begs Yuan Shikai to save them.
And does he?
Instead, Yuan negotiates with Sun Yat-sen's revolutionaries. He essentially trades the dynasty for the presidency of a new republic.
Wow.
On February 12, 1912, the terrified court issues an edict forcing the 6-year-old child Emperor Puyi to abdicate. Without a massive war, without a glorious final stand, over 2,000 years of imperial governance in China quietly came to an end.
What an incredibly sprawling, tragic epic. Let's recap this massive arc we've covered today.
Jim?
A tiny group of Manchu outsiders squeaks past the Great Wall. They use brilliant administrative architecture, like the inclusive 8 banners, the psychological rebranding of China, and the encrypted palace memorials to build China's largest empire.
Right.
They oversee a massive economic revolution and a population boom fueled by the humble American potato. But they are ultimately undone by the Malthusian trap. The systemic rot of corruption, their tragic inability to structurally adapt to the industrialized threat of the Opium Wars, and the apocalyptic trauma of the Taiping Rebellion.
And it is absolutely essential to remember that the ghost of the Qing dynasty still heavily defines the world today.
Right.
If you want to understand modern China, if you want to understand its vast geographic borders, its multi-ethnic makeup in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, or its deep abiding sensitivity to foreign intervention stemming from the century of humiliation, you have to deeply understand the Qing. The map of China today is, in essence, the map drawn by those Manchu emperors.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. The Qing dynasty demanded ultimate conformity. They were willing to slaughter tens of thousands just to force a specific haircut on millions of men under the threat of death, all to enforce unity and obedience.
Yeah.
But in the end, it wasn't the British gunboats or the Japanese modern army or even Hong Yuquan's peasant mystics that truly severed the dynasty's spine. It was their own decision in 1905 to abolish the imperial exams, the one cultural institution that actually bound the minds of the people to the state.
By trying to finally modernize and save themselves, they inadvertently cut their own life support.
It makes you wonder, as we look at massive, rigid institutions in our own world today, whether they be governments, corporations, or educational systems, is the greatest danger in steadfastly refusing to change, or is it in finally deciding to change just a little too late and cutting the wrong wire?
Yeah, that's a profound thought to end on.
Think about that. Keep digging into the sources, keep asking questions, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.